What if the day that
Cold
split
night
her
out
life
there.
down the
We
middle,
made it back
the
just
day
in
a
time.
winter-bitten
Supper's
wind
still warm.
worried the seams
Smells
of a
better than the wind,
stagecoach
that's for sure.
and made
saved you a
strangers
bowl,
clutch
Pa.
one another without
Appreciate
meaning
that,
to,
son.
Come
was
sit.
not a curse at all, but the precise hinge on which the rest of her forever would quietly swing. Even as Ella Hart, with a schoolteacher's poise and a fugitive's heartbeat, held to a leather strap and watched the bighorns lift like pale ghosts through glass salted with grit, telling herself she had come only to be Miss Hart, telegraphist and tutor, while the land, stern as scripture, resolved to test whether that vow could survive its weather. And what if, when wood shrieked and an axle surrendered and bodies pinwheeled with baggage in a hail of dust, the first hand to find her belonged to a man who had learned to move inside chaos the way other men moved through prayer, a broad-shouldered rider whose steadiness fit danger, as if both had been tailored together, who would later be called Cole McKinnon by those who owed him more than thanks, and whose gray eyes met hers for a breath-long truce neither understood. And what if that meeting, half accident, half design, stitched the first, finest seam in a life Ella had promised herself would be plain, quiet, and clean, even as Dusty Ford, with its bell that tolled like a tired heart, and its street that wore last season's mud like penance, measured the stranger, and the stranger measured the town. Inside Martha Lee's warm kitchen, where coffee argued back against the frost and a spare room weighted with sheets that smelled faintly of sun, Ella steadied her hands, only to lose the steadiness again when Ephraim Briggs, whose smile was cut to the width of a ledger, pressed oily courtesies upon her and called them welcome, while she catalogued the tells. Polish too bright on boots that never met a pasture, eyes that warmed in public and cooled in the space between blinks, and vowed, as she accepted work at the key and chalk at the slate, that she would make children brave without training them to beg for kindness. Days folded into a rhythm that tasted of iron stoves and chalk dust, of messages rattling across wire like distant hoofbeats, of a quiet writer crossing town with the plain economy of a man who had outlived the need to spend words. And each time Ella noticed Cole in profile, at the livery, at the smithy, at the edge of late light, recognition passed between them like two lanterns answering across snow. When the key erupted one knifing night, and the dots and dashes gathered themselves into a warning sharp enough to cut her breath, Coyote Riders, Movement West, Silver Mesa named plain as a dare, Ella ran that paper through the wind to Sheriff Pike, who muttered oaths, and in the very moment the door swung and Cole appeared, he was already turning, as if the message had reached him in the bone before it reached his ear. And the rancher rode as a man rides when he intends to make an ending, out where the snow softened gunfire into bruised flashes. He broke a theft with calm geometry, spooking horses, splitting a herd, choosing mercy over blood because the man he had been no longer had a vote over the man he wanted to be. And when the dust of talk settled next morning, it settled on Cole's name and on Ella's window, beneath which a stranger's boots had written patience in mud, and she understood with a teacher's clarity that someone in town had begun to study her work the way a thief studies a lock. She opened the school in a refurbished saloon whose mirrors remembered card sharps and whose stove remembered winters, and when Mrs. Gable breezed in with her daughters and the old poison of who belongs where, Ella stood as if the floor had been hammered for that posture and said without a tremor that every child belonged, and that was the end of the question, then taught on while shame burned two small faces in the back row until it cooled into attention. That afternoon Briggs offered double pay to teach only the chosen, and Ella declined without ornament, and with a spine that made hypocrisy blink first, and then the road to the O'Malley cabin grew long with cold and short with purpose, and returning, she found Cole waiting with a saddle mended thoughtfully enough to feel like conversation, which is how supper at Martha's happened, and how the habit of caution in both of them frayed quietly at the edges. Trouble, being what it is, stitched itself through everything at once. Pike found an envelope wearing Briggs's seal where rustlers had played at vanishing, Ella's satchel, the small archive of her true name and her mother's last words, went missing and returned in Cole's hand, open just enough to tell him what the signature John Blackjack Coran could restart if spoken aloud. A blue bandana rider with a limp began haunting the edges of her days. A lightning fire at Silver Mesa called the town to buckets and prayers, and Ella's voice, steadier than her lungs, talked a lost child toward the corner where Cole broke flame and board to carry the boy out. And when the embers hissed almost, the satchel lay by the creek with its secret staring, the moment between privacy and protection over. And in the hallway outside her door, under a hard little lamp, she told him the truth he had promised not to demand, and he answered with a promise she had never been offered. "You are safe does not mean you owe me." After that, Menace learned their names. A midnight alley delivered the man with the limp and the hunger for her letter, and Cole arrived out of shadow like the short wall between threat and harm, and the stranger retreated with the promise of a next time. By morning the mask finally dropped from Sheriff Pike, whose helpfulness had always been a kind of scaffolding around rot, and the plan to divert coyote riders with a false wire and a trap in Devil's Gap collapsed into a canyon of ricochets until Ella, whose courage always preferred intelligence for a partner, drove a supply wagon into the maw and fired a flare that turned horses into witnesses and outlaws into confusion. After which Briggs and Pike cornered her among keys and coils and threats, and she, that specialist in the direction of small forces, threw a lamp into a stove so the fire would blind the wicked long enough for Cole to take the living way. Rope, not bullet. Justice, not rage. And when the town sat pews like jurors and pieties like shields, Pike spat Texas at the man who wouldn't be shamed, and a farmer stood to say that accidental bullets sometimes rescue the living, and the room, which had leaned toward the convenient story, found itself shouldered back toward the true one. What begins as rescue matures into structure, so it was not a surprise when Cole marked out a strip by Cottonwood Creek and named it with stakes, school and wire and a home that would not need to apologize for being wanted, and no surprise when a porch wedding, quiet as a vow and strong as seasoned timber, put the word choose inside a ring, nor even a surprise when laughter replaced suspense in the soundscape of evenings. Though Ella, who understood the arithmetic of scarcity, was surprised at how quickly abundance tolerates delight. Still, the past refuses to be unfelt, so there were nights when blue bandanas cut alleyways, and days when the town's taller money moved its lips around threats, and there were hours when the word virgin turned from the sharp joke of a dangerous life into a soft joke of a safe bed, and all of it stitched itself into belonging without apology. Then came a story colder and closer. A widow in a restaurant shed, 2 underfed children trading fairness instead of food, a plate that taught arithmetic badly, and Caleb Thornton, a man who had learned the price of pride too young and the cost of silence too exactly, pushed through a door and counted out the debt others preferred as gossip, bought dignity in cash and shelter in urgency, and hitched an impossible night to his will. With a wagon broken, horses loosed back toward sense, and snow rising to make miles behave like arguments, he shouldered the boy and talked the woman through white that wanted to unmake her. And when heat and blankets and the slow courage of thaw started writing life back into small fingers, Eleanor Hayes called a stranger the reason, and he, with grief worn smooth where rings are usually bright, called it simply not leaving people to the cold. What follows when people survive is the long work. Emma's cough that wanted to become a thief but didn't because steadiness and honey argued it down. Danny's first lessons in horses and usefulness, which built a boy back from hunger one measured scoop and quiet praise at a time. A town's jaw tightening around rumor and contracts, followed by a front porch debate with men who mistook commerce for character, and Caleb answering with the old law that children are not currency. A night of fever when 2 adults who had not asked for love and were suspicious of miracles took turns saying, "Stay" to a sweat-shiny child until "stay" sounded like a fact. A morning when gratitude sat heavier than coffee and something like family sat heavier than fear. Then came the question of reputation, and the walk through town done openly because secrets, even when innocent, behave like surrender once the bullies have called them policy, and the pastor offered redemption in the shape of marriage, which they declined until they could want it for themselves, and not because he needed a sermon with an ending. Deciding to be permanent required terms. No charity disguised as vows, no fear disguised as prudence, no running disguised as wisdom. And when Eleanor set those terms with the exactness of a woman who had carried her child through a blizzard, and her name through a year of slander, Caleb matched them with the exactness of a man who knew that a promise counts only when it has been measured against the worst of the weather. The license was secured with daylight and witnesses. The judge brought more than law. He brought the caution that questions about dead miners wake living wolves. And the house, which had once been styled for grief, was dressed by women who had remembered their courage late but fully, bringing evergreen and apologies, and a veil the color that time gives to beauty. And in that room, rinsed with winter light, vows were spoken plainly, kissed gently, and met with the specific applause of neighbors practicing the art of doing better than last season. Of course, the men who profited by rot arrived after midnight with fire for punctuation and money for motive, and of course Caleb met them with a rifle that wanted to speak, but didn't need to because Sheriff Braddock, having decided which version of himself to be, collected deputies and evidence and the sudden weight of the governor's attention. And the torches learned the old lesson that heat does not guarantee power. Danger, stubborn as drought, lingered anyway, so locks were checked and children were taught procedures. And truth was spoken to small faces without varnish because small faces can carry weight if they know adults will share it. And in the blue hour before dawn, with fear making small weather systems in every room, love named itself out loud in a living room that had seen too many kinds of silence. And upstairs, marriage became marriage in the tender way that turns vows into muscle. The rest became a ledger of reckonings and repairs. Arrests that read like a list of men who had mistaken influence for innocence. Trials that bent imperfectly toward justice but bent. Confessions from inspectors who remembered their consciences. A memorial where Michael Hayes's name was lifted clean of the mud others had packed around it. And a town that decided to rebuild not just its image but its habits. Children grew into sturdier laughter. Porches learned to host unremarkable sunsets again. Danny's hands acquired the knowledge of fences that keep not just horses but families safe. Emma's lungs learned the rhythm of wellness, and her patience the rhythm of care. And a small green dress once sewn against winter hung in a wardrobe that now smelled of cedar and pie instead of snow and fear. Spring tried its luck, succeeded, and found them mending what could be mended and grieving what must be grieved. Summer turned work into ritual and ritual into belonging. Autumn set out the long table of harvest, and winter, ever itself, returned to measure whether the lessons had been learned. On a porch that had kept vigil and kept promises, Eleanor one evening took Caleb's hand and set it against the future stirring beneath her ribs. And he, who knew the arithmetic of loss and the grammar of hope, chose the latter with a steadiness that made fear share the room without running it. In time, there was a son named for the past and the present both, a household where Rebecca's gentleness and Michael's courage were allowed to keep their chairs, and a town that discovered mercy makes better neighbors than memory alone. A year to the day after a door splintered and a life rerouted, Eleanor found Caleb in the barn with thunder, where tools hang, and truths don't need polish, and told him the thank you she had been writing slowly with every ordinary dinner and every ordinary dawn. He answered the way he always had, with a kind of unadorned choosing that made promises behave like structures. And when the call to supper came threaded with baby laughter and old jokes about checker rules, they walked in harness with all they had won and all they had risked to win it. And if, as snow began again in a territory that respects no one's calendar, They stood a little longer on the threshold just to verify that the sound they were hearing was in fact their own house breathing, that the light in the windows was not a trick of weather but proof of warmth. Honestly earned, they could be forgiven the pause, since surviving had taught them to inventory blessings without counting them like coins, and loving had taught them to call a thing finished only when it was also beginning. So they went inside together, where the table waited and the stories kept themselves available, because the human heart, having outwalked blizzards and buried ghosts and argued the world back into decency, prefers, at last, the stubborn miracle of ordinary days. And if someone asked, later and softly, what exactly had changed between the first howl of wind against broken timber and the last easy laugh around a full table, Ella and Cole and Caleb and Eleanor, each with the diction of the life that trained them, would say that hunger taught truth faster than sermons, that mercy makes steadier shelter than judgment, that names redeemed are better legacies than fortunes guarded, and that families built by choosing are as binding as blood, perhaps more so. They would add, because accuracy matters, that the land still imposes its seasons and people still fail one another sometimes and storms still arrive uninvited. Yet the house stands, the wire sings, the fence holds, the children thrive, and the vows do not flinch, which is another way of saying the worst day was not a wreck but a doorway, and the life beyond it, long and authentic, was the point all along.